What's going on, everybody? Once again, this is Greg Alice with Live High Five. Friday, we are out of work, and it is a long weekend, and we love it because we're going to sleep until at least 9 a.m. every day, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. But right now, we're going to do a little something different on Live High Five. I have an author by the name of Stephen Aaron Gray who is releasing his first fiction novel titled Ant Farm tomorrow, Saturday, the 30th of August. And you might not know who Stephen Gray is by first name, but you'll definitely know who he is by his music name, which is DJ Freaky Flow. But we're going to stay away from that because he's a man of many talents, and all musicians have other interests. And this seems to be his, and it's a pretty good one. Ant Farm drops tomorrow. So, author Stephen Aaron Gray has recently published his very first fiction novel. Why are we interviewing an author? 5-5? Well, he asked politely, for one thing. That, and the fact that he helped introduce us to drum and bass way back in the 90s definitely helped, too. DJ Freaky Flow ring a name, anybody? But let's leave the 180 beats per minute at the door for a while. Stephen's book, titled Ant Farm, explores the not-so-fictitious idea of a group of sentient creatures breaking away from an oppressive and heavily armed regime in favor of forming their own more just and equal society. The problem, however, often cyclical in nature, is that some individuals, in this case ants, rise to the top of the social sphere, while others remain as mere workers or become dregs of society. Drawing parallels from how many human societies seem to act at times, Ant Farm is practically an indictment of current society. The powers that be, those in control and empower to protect and serve the health and well-being of their populations, can, and oftentimes do, find themselves corrupted by material gain, influence, and power. Sound familiar? The fact that Stephen managed to write an entire book of this caliber without one derogatory or offensive word astounds me. So, without further ado, we're going to talk to Stephen about his new book and first book, Ant Farm. Stephen, how's everything going, man? Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Live High Five today. Big endeavor going on right now.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very last thing you said.
A big endeavor you're finding yourself in right now, huh?
It is, and also thank you for taking the time to talk to me, man. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited about this. This is a brand new thing for me, very different from anything I've done in the music realm, but exciting nonetheless.
But it's still creative art, and since you opened the door, I mean, obviously people know you for the music side. We all know that already, but I'm pretty sure several people don't have any idea that you were also an aspiring author. How did this come about, man? Tell us a little bit about your thought process about this.
Sure. You know, it's I've always been, I shouldn't say always, for a while, I've been interested in sort of, greater world issues that are happening globally, from war to poverty to, to all kinds of things. And, I thought, I've studied a lot about it and read a lot about it, and I've sort of developed my own philosophy, taking bits and pieces from other people's philosophies and sort of realizing my own truths. And certainly lots of other people share the philosophy that I hold, which in a nutshell is that people should really be able to do whatever they want as long as they're not hurting other people. And, there are a lot of books out there about this kind of a philosophy, but there aren't any that really break it down for a layperson, for an average Joe, or even for a young adult that's not really interested in heavy politics or heavy philosophical discussion. And I thought, if I want to explain this kind of philosophy to somebody, how can I do it? What book could I possibly give them that wouldn't bore them to death or would go over their head or they find too dry or whatever? And I can't think of many. There's a lot out there for people that are already interested in this kind of stuff or for people that want to learn more. But if people just want sort of a casual story to teach them about these kinds of concepts, I can't think of any books that exist that do that. There are other books, like one that I drew heavily from, which is George Orwell's Animal Farm, which does that kind of thing, but with a completely different philosophy. And so I saw his book, and I also saw other books like, I think his name is Daniel Quinn, who wrote Ishmael and My Ishmael, and Ayn Rand, who wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. These are people who have told about, who have taught philosophy through fiction, and I sort of wanted to do something similar, but with a different philosophy. And, being involved just in music doesn't allow you, especially in drum and bass, which is mostly instrumental music, doesn't really allow me to convey those kinds of messages. And a book is really the only way I could think of doing it. And so that was sort of the genesis of how this came to be.
All right. And now, also, obviously, the book is called Ant Farm. Where on earth did you come up with the idea to use ants and cockroaches as a fictional political tale which really rings true in a lot of regards, which we'll talk about later on?
Sure. I was saying earlier that sort of one of the models that I really admired for this kind of thing was George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Yes, sir.
But as I was trying to play out my story, I was thinking, why don't I do sort of an homage or tribute to Orwell's book, because it does such a good job of teaching people things in a really simplified way. But farm animals aren't going to really work for what I want to do. What could I do instead? And I got to thinking about other kinds of creatures. I didn't want to just do humans, because then it's way too literal. With something more literal, people want more information, and I didn't want to give an information-heavy book. So I was thinking, what else could I do? And the idea came to me of, an ant farm, thinking about these little tiny worker ants, and, you can see ant farms that you can buy in the store, and they're just hustling along and working away. And I thought that's sort of a pretty good metaphor for humans working hard and busily. And, those were going to be my main characters, and I also had to think of, what would be an appropriate villain. And, you go back to George Orwell's Animal Farm, and he, eventually the pigs become the villain. And I was thinking, what's really out there in the insect kingdom that really scares people or just really disgusting? And I thought cockroaches were a good fit.
Yes, sir. Okay. Well, all right. To go into the actual process before we dive a little bit deeper, as your first book, it's depthy. It's a long book. It's, pushing the 200-page mark, and there's really a lot going on. So tell us a little bit about your writing experience. How long did it take you? And, what was the process like? Because this is it's still a creative art.
Yeah, sure. I think I started this conceptually in 2009. I'd be DJing, I'd be out on the road, and I'd have these little ideas, and I write them down in my phone. And, after I had a bunch of ideas, I think I said, okay, let's put some time aside and just start writing. And, I went to, I was probably in a couple coffee shops with my laptop, and I really started writing. And that's because I wasn't doing it dedicated. I was busy with other kinds of things, music and touring. So that obviously slowed down my progress with this book. But it probably took, a first draft I probably wrote. I would guess I wrote the whole thing in maybe 6 months to a year. I know you said 200 pages, but that's not really that long in the grand scheme of things. Most books actually are much, much, much longer.
True.
So then after I had this first draft, I read it and I reread it and I tweaked some things and changed some things or thought of some additional ideas to put in. And anytime I had a new idea, that would have to, I'd have to rejig the whole story because maybe something that I wanted to add, if I've got a 200-page story finished and I want to throw something in on page 50, that's going to change how things play out on page 170. So that took a little bit of time. And then once I had a general story I was pretty happy with, I gave it to a few people to read through, and they gave me some feedback, and a lot of it was really valuable feedback, and I changed some more things, and And then I started, once I had a pretty close to final draft that I was happy with, I sent it off to a few literary agents and publishers. Again, this is something that was spread out over time. I didn't approach like 50 different agents in a week. It was really over like the span of 2 years. And finally, there was one publisher, a small publisher, but great publisher called Headline Books out of West Virginia that were interested in the story. They gave me another few points, and and I just finished it up, and that's the version we've got now.
Oh, very good. That's excellent. So it wasn't just it's not an overnight thing, just like establishing any career. It's not an overnight thing, folks. So you got to put the time in, and that's how everything will come to fruition for you. So
sure.
Now I want to dive a bit deeper into some of the subject matter, because as the ants separated from society, obviously you have graphs in there mentioning the population growth, mentioning economics, mentioning violent crime, and rest assured that again, there are a lot of parallels that we can put to the human race. You discuss prohibition. You discuss the control of the transportation industry and postal control, the price of education, murder, violence, substance abuse, gambling. All of these things are mentioned, and additionally, you had a very might equals right situation occur on a few occasions. Explain a little bit about maybe not only the rationale and the approach that you took, but also talk about some of your own feelings on these matters.
Sure. A couple of people that read early drafts of the book said to me, you're really tackling a lot of issues, and you're not really getting too in-depth with any of them. Like you're talking about economics and currency models and war and drug addiction and racism. And, I think when I read the book after and I just made a short list of all the issues, I think there's like 40 or 45 different current, social world issues that are explored. And so some of the early people that read this were saying to me, like, why not do fewer and get more in depth with them all? And I said, the reason is because they all have the same theme. All of them, whether I'm talking about gambling or, and there are even some issues I didn't discuss. I didn't talk about prostitution in the book. I didn't talk about intellectual property law. But even those, to me, have this very similar theme. And the theme is that when any entity, namely historically a state or a government, tries to force its will on people, things go really, really, really bad over time in any of those issues. And if I just explored a couple, I don't know if the reader would be able to see that pattern. But when I cram 40 or 45 issues into the book, and they all turn out the same way, and all for the same reason, I'm hoping that the reader will start to get the point that, like, okay, state trying to control people against their will, no matter what the issue is a really bad thing. And I think for me, this was also, I had this revelation, I think, a few years before I wrote my book, because there were still a few issues that I held on to that I thought, like, okay, well, okay, the government does these things poorly, but there's still a few things they need to do. And it's after you see them failing again and again and again and again on every single thing they touch, that I started to realize, no, there's nothing that they won't screw up. And I wanted to sort of wrap that message into my book, and that's why there's so many issues that are being dealt with there. And I feel like that sort of espouses my philosophy most accurately that way. And there's also an easy fix to it that I think a lot of people are scared to explore, which is interact voluntarily with people. Don't force people to do things. But that's a scary kind of concept to people when you talk about police and judiciary systems and military. How could we ever do that voluntarily? Well, my book also tries to explore some of those things and how they can be done without violence.
Right on, right on. And actually, another very interesting feature of the book is that you include graphs. You include graphs in the book, which I touched on earlier, which kind of document the growth. It documents income. It documents price of food, economics. A wide variety of things are covered, and you can see patterns. So how did you come up with the graphs? How did this come to fruition?
Sure. Well, I think they're more charts than graphs. When I think of a graph, I think of like a line graph or a bar graph. So, but the way I came up with that was I think I didn't start with it, and I started without them. And after a few chapters, I was getting confused because, okay, well, are things better or worse? I don't know. What's the data say? You know? And so I made up some big data and put it in to sort of support the point that I'm making. Obviously, it's fake because everything in this story is fictional. They're walking, talking ants. So I needed to make up some fake data to accompany it. But it is, it's not literally based on real-world data, but it certainly is modeled after real-world data that I've seen. I looked at violent crime and GDP statistics and literacy rates and things like that for 20 or 30 different countries, and I found very similar patterns, which was that as the governments in these countries are more controlling, all of those things get worse statistically. And conversely, there are other countries where they're letting go of their power and letting people take control of their lives. And in those countries, things were getting better in all of those areas. And so I thought that including these kinds of charts at the beginning of each chapter would really help the reader see the quote-unquote concrete results of the actions that the government's taking in the book.
Right on. Now, you mentioned for some people, or for some ants in the book, life got better. There were business problems, of course, and there were some political contests, things along those lines. But for some of the ants in the book, things got better. For the majority, things got a little bit more difficult. Yeah. So, I suppose, and that's a vast parallel to what we see in our society in the United States right now. People are making a lot more money off of people, and some people are having a hard time. So, obviously, we want a just society. We want, morals. We want egalitarianism. We want people to be free to do what they want. But I suppose it's freedom at what cost? In the book, who would you say is the standout character that you think would be the best one to emulate in the real world, in real time?
Sure. Well, I think there's lots of characters in the book that, let me say this. So to the first part of your question, you were saying you notice a lot of parallels in the U.S. with, if you want to use terminology as, say, the haves or the have-nots, but certainly people with money and power and people without. And generally in the U.S., but not just in the U.S., I lived in Canada for 30 years as well, and I've also been to other countries, and this part is not dramatically different no matter which country you are in the world, and that part is that if you're politically connected, if you have friends in government that can pull strings for you, and a lot of times those people are board members of corporations or CEOs of corporations or owners of corporations. They're the ones that are politically connected because they're making campaign contributions and they're getting kickbacks, not necessarily in the form of money, but certainly in the form of favorable legislation. And so on a much more simplified level, intentionally. So I tried to convey that in my book. And so you've certainly got ants in my book that partake in those kinds of shenanigans, and they certainly, some of them certainly reap the benefits. But also it can come back and bite you in the ass, right? Like your political friend today can be your political enemy tomorrow, and that could be the end of you. And so that happens to some ants in my book as well. And I'd say there's also a handful of ants that don't partake in those kinds of games. They just go out, they do their work, they try to provide a good or a service for the rest of the population. They don't try and, wield the sword of the state and force people to do things against their will. And I think those are the kinds of people to emulate. And certainly in the real world, there's lots of those kinds of people too. There's a lot of people out there that are just hardworking dudes that make stuff and want people to buy it or use it if they think it's valuable and useful. And they don't try to legislate their competition out of business the way you see, taxi cab companies nowadays trying to do to Uber and Lyft.
Right. Right on. Right on. Well, I guess I have a couple more philosophical questions, but I also want to talk about you have some tour dates coming up, and it seems that you're going to be doing some promotional appearances. You're going to have books with you to do signings. When can we expect these to be taking place?
Well, the one I know I can confirm right now is end of September. It's me and Danny the Wild Child. We're playing in Baltimore with Black Sun Empire, so I'll definitely be there, and I'll definitely have books that people can buy there too. Some of the other dates are still being worked out. I'm still waiting for word on a couple of things, but hopefully there'll be more in the pipe. And then some Canadian shows as well in October. But I'll definitely post all of those on my Facebook page, on my website, on freakyflow.com, and also, strictly book stuff. I'll also post on my book website, which both of these URLs lead to the same place, either StephenAaronGray.com or AntFarmBook.com. So I'll definitely be posting all of those things as they come up immediately.
Awesome, and I'll make sure that those links are firmly embedded into our conversation here and at the bottom, so they'll be easy to spot.
Thank you, sir.
A pleasure. Now, I guess I'll combine the question. I'd like to say, maybe as a person who's lived internationally, traveled internationally, how do you think a just society should operate, and or what is the overall message you want to convey with Ant Farm? Your first question. No.
Yeah, I think those are two different but closely related questions. So let me answer the first one first, which is, how would I like to see an ideal society? And I think the first thing that any realistic person has to acknowledge is that there's no utopia. It's just not possible to achieve a perfect society without any crime, without any violence, without any poverty. That's just not possible. People have tried it, and usually when they try really, really hard, it ends up exacerbating the problems, and you get more poverty and more crime and more violence and that kind of thing. So I certainly don't want to see anyone try to go for perfection, because usually that involves forcing people to do things against their will, and that ends in disaster. But I would like to see a society with the minimal amounts of these kinds of things: minimal crime, minimal poverty, maximum prosperity. Again, this is not a utopia. There's still going to be problems no matter what, but I think that kind of place that I just mentioned is realistic, and I think the way, it can be achieved. Oh, hold on one second, sorry.
No problem.
Sorry about that. I think the way it can be achieved is if governments in the world stop trying to force people to do things that they want them to do. And sometimes their opinions on what's right and what's wrong comes from the majority of people, but as we've seen through history, the majority's not always right. The majority around most countries in the world was in favor of slavery for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And obviously we understand now that the majority was wrong every single time. So, I think people have to start to realize that forcing people to do things against their will is is not the answer. And when you have a more voluntary society, things go better, and you can start to get closer and closer to that society with a minimal amount of poverty and crime and that kind of thing. So, concrete examples that I'd like to see, I would like to see the government completely end the war on all drugs entirely, because that creates so many problems, from, exacerbating addiction to increasing, gang warfare, because when you prohibit something, it's still going to happen. It's just going to have a criminal element to it, and people are going to get shot and killed over it. Whereas if you don't ban it and people can buy marijuana or even cocaine in Walmart, there's no drug turf wars. I've never heard of somebody getting shot in the crossfire in Compton over a bottle of Advil, and it's because it's legal.
True.
So that's just one example, but I'd like to see all kinds of things like that. And I'd also like to see some of the services, or I say quote unquote services, or so-called services, that the government offers to us, but really forces us to pay for and use. I'd like to see some of those things where the government would say, okay, look, we're not going to force you to use them anymore. If you want to, pay us for them. And if you don't want to, don't pay us for them. And if somebody comes along that can offer some of these things better or more efficiently, go buy them from them instead. So I think, with those pretty simple, they're conceptually simple, but implementing them would be just, a huge undertaking for various reasons. But I think that with those things, you see dramatic improvements in the quality of life for people all over the world. And then the second part of your question, I forgot now.
Well, just basically...
I remember. You said, what is the message of my book? And
overall
I think,
goal in the message.
Yeah. I think the overall message of my book is what I just said. So, more greater peace, prosperity, and happiness, and minimizing suffering is possible if people stop forcing each other to do things and instead choose to voluntarily interact with one another.
Very good. And I have one more question written down, but as this is the first time I'm actually interviewing an author, I'd like to know if there's anything that you'd like to add that you may have liked to have answered that I didn't ask today. I'd like to give you the time to maybe address them, and you can help me out here as well.
Yeah. I mean, no, I think we covered a lot of good ground. I mean, I guess I can only think of, to people that are really, I guess it's a message sort of to people that are really tied to the status quo and who have grown up thinking, that government has all the solutions because that's what you're taught in government schools. And certainly that's what I was taught in government schools, and that's what I believed for a while. At least consider that might not be true. Consider it. Look into it, explore it. Hopefully my book will, I'm not expecting my book will convince everybody or even anybody, but maybe it will shed some light on things you hadn't thought about before, and maybe it will send you down a path to want to learn more about things, and then, pick up other books that really do dive into the hard data that can back up and substantiate the claims that I make in my book that's intended to be a little more fun and for the average Joe. And I think also that, I tried to write it also hopefully for young adults. I hope I didn't get too complicated for younger adults. I don't think I did, because I think that too often people, adults, older adults, look at kids or young adults and think, they're too young and stupid to grasp these kinds of concepts. And I don't know, if you're a little older and you have somebody that's maybe 12 or 13 or 14 in your life, try this book. Try sending them this book and see how they react to it. I'm just curious to see if they'll get it. Certainly if it is age appropriate for them, and I think it is, I think it's a different and much needed perspective that they're not going to really get from government schools or from most, news outlets. And so hopefully this will be a different alternative outlet that can shed a little bit of light on some of these subjects.
Excellent. Very good. Well, and I guess the last question I have for you today is this is your first endeavor at this. And it's your first book. I'm sure you put in the time. I'm sure there were many coffee drank and many a hair possibly pulled out, but you've completed it. It's in print. It's dropping tomorrow. Very proud and happy for you.
Thank you.
What advice could you possibly give to some of the other aspiring writers out there as well, from your experience with Ant Farm, that might help them kind of ease the process or give them a sense that they can do this?
Sure. This is a really hard question for me to answer, and because I'm so new to it. When people ask me for advice with DJing or music business advice, I've done that for 21 or 22 years. I'm sort of a veteran there, and I've seen a lot and done a lot and tried a lot of things and failed and tried other things and succeeded. So I can give I feel like I can give really good advice in that world. This is my first book. I don't even know if it's going to be successful yet. I hope it is, but, it may completely flop, and then who wants advice from an author whose book nobody bought, right? Like, I don't think that'll happen, but you never know. So it's hard for me to give advice because I'm still looking for advice, to tell you the truth, from other more experienced authors. But I can say that the path I followed so far, it was a long one over the course of several years. And, if you feel passionately about something and you want to write about it, I think first you have to know how to write well. I think a lot of people don't really know just basic grammar rules. And so it may help to take, a writing course or an effective writing course. And then I think a strategy I tried to employ was, and I do this in life with anything, but specifically here, I try to put myself in the shoes of my audience. So I'm trying to think, okay, there's this philosophy that not a lot of people have been exposed to, the philosophy of freedom and true liberty and not attacking your neighbor because you disagree with them. And it sounds like it makes sense, but when you get to the nuts and bolts, it's a lot of times counterintuitive, and a lot of people don't really know it. So I'm trying to think of, like, if I'm in that audience's shoes or the reader's shoes, what would it take to convince me? What would keep me interested if I never heard anything about this before? And so I think maybe that's some good advice. It's, as an author, try to put yourself in the shoes of the reader who's never been exposed to your messages, who doesn't know where you're going yet, and try to keep it interesting for that person. If someone was writing for you, what would you want to see in here? What would make you convinced that this is something worthwhile? As for the business side of it, after that, it's very hard for me to get into. I sent the manuscript around, and it was a couple of years, but if you're confident in it, and if you know people that have read it that are also confident, keep pushing it, and hopefully you'll be able to ink a deal. And, in this day and age, self-publishing is still an option, and a viable option. I think several people do quite well with self-publishing. So you always want to keep that in mind as well.
Right on. Well, good. I think we covered some pretty good ground with the book today, and I'm looking forward to see it released. I'm hoping that people give it a shot. It touches on some, interesting subjects in a very interesting way. So I just want to say best of luck to you on the release tomorrow, and thank you very much for taking the time to speak with Live High Five today. This is a first for me, as it is a first for you, in that this is the first time I'm interviewing an author about a book. So very much looking forward to the release,